Imagine a bond so intense, so all-consuming, that the line between where you end and another person begins it completely vanishes.
Right, you look in the mirror and it's not just you anymore.
Exactly. It's this shared entity. You don't just care for this person. I mean, their survival becomes the literal baseline for your own existence.
Which is intense.
Very. And in the real world, psychologists actually call this identity fusion. So welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to dissect the brutal, fascinating neurobiology behind this phenomenon.
It's a heavy topic, but so incredibly interesting.
It really is. And to do this, we're using a pretty unique stack of sources today. We've got a dense research dossier on the psychology of devotion, and we're pairing it with the dark fantasy novel, Vitae, The Awakening.
Which is such a phenomenal pairing, honestly, because fiction, it often acts as this magnifying glass for real human psychology.
Yeah, you can push things to the absolute limit.
Yeah, exactly. By looking at the extreme life-or-death scenarios in Vitae, we can actually isolate the mechanical gears of human attachment theory, the stuff that operates quietly in our daily lives.
So our mission today is to track the journey of this character, Kurien. He's a Vitae conscript, and he's bound by this ancient law to protect a Covenness named Myasuchi.
Right.
And later on, he forms this incredibly intense trauma bond with a survivor named Sharina. Now, the research dossier introduces this concept of identity fusion right out of the gate.
Yeah, it's the core framework.
And reading it against Kurien's story made me realize how drastically this differs from our standard cultural idea of quote-unquote true love, or even just simple loyalty.
Oh, absolutely. Because typical attachment, the healthy kind we usually think about, assumes two distinct individuals.
Right, like you're a team, but you're still you.
Exactly. In standard attachment, the ego boundaries remain intact. You have your desires, your fears, your identity, and your partner has theirs. You collaborate.
But identity fusion is different.
Very different. It's a psychological state where those boundaries utterly collapse. The psychological concept of the self merges with another person.
Wow.
Yeah, the individual experiences a total loss of separation. So your brain begins to process threats to the other person as literal physical threats to your own body.
Which leads to a terrifyingly high willingness to sacrifice yourself.
Exactly.
And we see this play out vividly with Kurien and Myasuchi. I mean, he is legally sworn to protect her, but the psychological entanglement goes so much deeper than a job.
It's not just a contract for him.
No, not at all. There are these scenes where he performs these really mundane, intimate tasks like acting as her masseur and bath attendant.
Right.
And he describes this servitude as a penance. It's agonizing for him because he's trapped in this crazy paradox where he deeply loves her, but he also violently hates his total lack of autonomy.
Which is classic identity fusion.
Is it?
Yeah, that paradox is the hallmark of a fused identity. The individual feels trapped because their sense of self relies entirely on a power dynamic they cannot control.
Well, that makes sense.
They resent the loss of their independence, but the thought of severing the bond feels psychologically identical to the thought of dying.
It's like you can't live with them, but your brain literally tells you that you will die without them.
That's exactly it.
You know, the analogy that kept coming to mind while reading the psychology dossier alongside the fantasy novel was the process of forging an alloy.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so you take two distinct separate metals and you throw them into a crucible of extreme heat, which in human terms represents trauma, violence, or just extreme environmental stress.
Right, the pressure cooker.
Exactly. They melt down together. But the crucial part of forging an alloy is actually the cooling process.
Because if you just keep them in the fire forever,
they just burn away, they get destroyed. It's the sudden drop in temperature, the moment of cooling, that locks their molecular structures together so you can never separate them again.
That cooling process is the perfect way to understand the mechanism here. In psychological terms, that sudden drop in temperature is what we call the devotional conditioning loop.
The devotional conditioning loop.
Yeah. Identity fusion doesn't happen in a vacuum. And it rarely happens in a totally safe environment. It is conditioned through repeated cycles of extreme danger, followed by sudden temporary safety.
Which operates a lot like intermittent reinforcement, right?
Exactly like that.
Because Kurien is constantly subjected to these massive emotional highs and lows.
Yeah.
Like he's thrown into lethal combat, he nearly dies. And then he experiences a quiet, highly intimate moment of safety with Myasuchi or Sharina.
And his brain doesn't know when the next moment of safety is coming.
Which makes it so much more addictive.
It does. Intermittent reinforcement is incredibly powerful because of how it manipulates the brain's dopamine system.
How so?
Well, when a reward, in this case safety and affection, is predictable, the brain releases a steady, manageable amount of dopamine. But when you are in a state of terror, your baseline dopamine drops. When safety is unexpectedly restored, the brain experiences a massive dopamine prediction error.
Oh, wow. So it overcompensates.
Exactly. It floods the system with a high, much stronger than normal, cementing the idea that this specific person is the sole source of relief in a totally hostile world.
So the psyche learns to just cling to them with absolute desperation.
Precisely.
But, okay, if intermittent reinforcement is that powerful and the brain is flooding the system with these massive chemical rewards just to secure survival, then this can't just be a psychological mindset.
No, it's highly physiological.
Right. Something deeply physical has to be happening in the brain when someone like Kurien oscillates between terror and devotion. It sounds like a literal addiction to a person.
It essentially is. The neurobiological foundation of this extreme devotion is staggering.
Walk me through it.
So when a human being is placed in a high-stress, terrifying environment, the amygdala sounds the alarm. It floods the body with cortisol, which is the primary stress hormone.
Right, the fight or flight stuff.
Exactly. You go into a state of hypervigilance, prepared to fight or flee. The logical prefrontal cortex shuts down, and the primitive survival brain takes over.
The alarm system is blaring and the body is primed for violence.
But here is where the chemistry creates the fusion. When that massive spike of cortisol and fear is paired with a moment of connection.
Like when someone grabs your hand in the dark.
Yes, or pulls you behind cover.
Yeah.
The brain releases a huge wave of oxytocin to signal social trust.
Okay, wait. I need to pause on the oxytocin piece.
Never.
Because everything I have ever read calls oxytocin the cuddle hormone. Like, is the chemical released when mothers bond with babies or when people are falling in love in a safe, warm environment?
That's the common perception, yeah.
So how does a hormone designed for trust and cuddling turn someone like Kurien into a fierce, lethal, and honestly, sometimes violently aggressive protector?
I'm so glad you brought that up because the cuddle hormone label is a massive oversimplification.
Oh.
Yeah. Oxytocin does strengthen emotional closeness, but its primary evolutionary function is to strengthen the bond with your specific in-group to ensure collective survival.
Okay, so it's about the group.
Right. When oxytocin is released, it downregulates the amygdala's fear response specifically toward that in-group member. You feel safe with them.
But what about everyone else?
That's the catch. Simultaneously, oxytocin dramatically amplifies defensive aggression toward anyone or anything perceived as an outgroup threat.
So the aggression isn't a side effect of the bond.
No.
It's a fundamental feature of it. It's not just a chemical signal that says, I love you. It's a signal that says, I love you and I will physically destroy anything that comes within a 10-foot radius of you.
That is the exact mechanism. It creates an intense, chemically enforced us against the world reality.
That's wild.
So when you pair the hypervigilance of cortisol with the in-group defense mechanism of oxytocin, and then you seal it with that massive dopamine reward we talked about earlier.
You get stress bonding.
Or trauma bonding, yes. The brain literally rewires its neural pathways, confusing the adrenaline of mortal danger with the passion of devotion.
That biological mechanism totally reframes this one pivotal scene in San Vitae.
Which one?
The part where Kurien and the survivor, Sharina, are trapped under heavy rubble. I mean, they are facing imminent death from these mechanical drone claws that are tearing through the debris.
Oh, right, the blood bond scene.
Yes. In their shared terror and this extreme physical vulnerability, they form a literal magical blood bond. The author uses this sci-fi and fantasy mechanic where their pulses begin beating in perfect unison.
It's so visceral.
It is. And Sharina's evoker energy channels directly into Kurien's claws so they can fight their way out together.
It's a brilliant narrative device to physicalize the psychology we've been talking about.
Honestly, reading the dossier on neuroplasticity right after that chapter made the connection unavoidable. The fantasy blood bond is just a literal physical manifestation of the cortisol-oxytocin loop. Their brains and bodies are actively rewiring under extreme stress to function as a single fused organism.
Yeah, the shared evoker energy is the chemical loop made visible.
Exactly. But, this brings us to what I think is the most uncomfortable implication of the whole dossier.
Which is?
Well, if extreme devotion is fundamentally a cocktail of cortisol, oxytocin, and dopamine forced upon us by trauma and environmental stress, it looks an awful lot like a biological trap.
It really does. It raises this massive question of whether a character like Kurien Or honestly, anyone experiencing identity fusion actually possesses free will.
That was the exact wall I hit. If his brain is just chemically addicted to the relief that Myasuchi or Sharina provides, then Kurien seems less like a noble protector and more like a meat puppet to his own neurochemistry.
A meat puppet, that's a dark way to put it, but accurate.
Right. Like, is his devotion just his conscious brain rationalizing a trauma bond, or does the choice actually mean something?
To answer that, we have to look through the philosophical lens of existential devotion, which the research dossier outlines really well.
Okay, lay it on me.
So, from a strict biological determinist view, yes, he's just reacting to chemistry. But existentialism argues that humans are meaning-making machines.
Meaning-making machines.
Right. In a chaotic, often oppressive world, the act of taking that biological urge and consciously choosing to devote yourself to it, that elevates the bond.
It becomes a declaration of meaning.
Exactly. It becomes an identity anchor in a reality that is actively trying to unmoor you.
And the political context of the Santerrie universe makes that act of meaning-making incredibly dangerous.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the society is ruled by the Santerrie elite, and they enforce the Didraith Accord, which is this rigid, centuries-old system that expressly forbids conscripts like Kurien and Covennesses like Myasuchi from communing or bonding on an emotional level.
It's a highly controlled environment.
Very. The entire societal structure is built on emotional emptiness, control, desensitization, and just cold detachment.
And they enforce that separation because connection is inherently destabilizing to a totalitarian structure.
Right, because if you're connected to a person, you're not connected to the state.
Exactly. When people fuse their identities, their loyalty shifts from the system to each other. In a world where you are legally ordered to be emotionally dead, loving someone is the most radical form of dissent available.
It is absolute rebellion.
It really is.
There is this line from Kurien that perfectly captures this existential choice.
Yeah.
He tells his bonded partner, "My life is yours, not by force, but by choice."
That's a powerful statement.
The tension there is just incredible because he fully acknowledges the power dynamics. He feels the physical, almost agonizing pull of the bond, but he looks at this neurochemical trap and decides to claim it as his own free will.
He owns it.
He does. And I found myself debating whether he's just suffering from a highly rationalized form of Stockholm Syndrome, or if the act of claiming it actually makes it a free choice.
Well, existential philosophy would argue that the origin of the bond, even if it is born of trauma and chemistry, matters less than what the individual decides to do with it.
Okay, so the choice is what matters.
Right. Kurien reclaims his agency by accepting the devotion. But, and this is a big but, this introduces the core ethical gray area of our entire deep dive today.
Which is?
When does devotion uplift the self, and when does it completely consume it? Because claiming identity fusion as your life's meaning is a massive double-edged sword.
Yeah, I see that. On the one hand, Kurien is finding immense self-empowerment. He's defining his own reason for living by finding his only joy and purpose in protecting these women.
It's his personal rebellion against an unfeeling society.
Right. He is carving out humanity where none is allowed to exist.
But on the other hand, he really toes the line of total self-erasure.
Oh, completely.
His identity fusion is so absolute that his basic sense of self-preservation just vanishes. At a critical point in the story, he's willing to let a demonic aspect, which is a literal manifestation of repressed rage and trauma, take over his soul just to save the people he loves.
He is fully prepared to cease existing as his own conscious self so that they can survive.
It's the ultimate tragic paradox of the protector archetype.
You become so fiercely devoted to saving someone else that you systematically destroy your own identity in the process. The you that loved them is gone, replaced by a weapon designed only to shield them.
Exactly.
And, bringing this out of the fantasy realm and looking at the sociology section of the dossier, it becomes clear that this isn't just a thought experiment.
Not at all.
The psychological weight of this kind of devotion is heavily documented in our actual society.
Yeah, the magic systems and demonic aspects in Vitae are just magnifications of very real human behavior. The dossier outlines specific populations that routinely exhibit these exact patterns of identity fusion in the cortisol-oxytocin loop.
Reading the dossier, the group that immediately stood out to me was combat veterans.
Oh, yes, that's a primary example.
The concept of unit cohesion in the military operates on these exact same mechanics. You take a group of individuals, put them in life or death conditions, and their neurochemistry just goes into overdrive.
Their baseline dopamine drops, cortisol spikes, and then that oxytocin floods in when they protect each other.
The dossier actually points out that unit cohesion is, functionally, a sanctioned real-world trauma bond.
It is. When you ask a combat veteran why they ran into enemy fire, the psychological data shows they rarely cite abstract concepts like patriotism or national duty in the moment.
What do they say?
They say they did it for the person next to them.
Why?
Their identity fused so completely with the group that the boundary between their own life and their squad mate's life dissolved. The threat to the unit was processed by their brain as a direct threat to their own body.
That's incredibly profound. The dossier also highlights survivors of severe, prolonged trauma.
Yes, that's another key population.
When two people endure a horrific, enclosed environment together, like an abusive household, captivity, or a massive natural disaster, that shared suffering accelerates emotional closeness at an unnatural speed.
Devotion stops being a romantic luxury.
Right. It becomes a literal physiological survival mechanism.
In those extreme environments, the fused individuals begin to literally regulate each other's nervous systems.
Wait, really? They regulate each other?
Yeah. One person's presence becomes the only thing capable of downregulating the other person's amygdala. Without the other, they remain trapped in hypervigilance.
So they are biologically dependent on each other to feel calm.
Exactly.
But the example that I think bridges the gap between these extreme environments and everyday life is caregiving.
Oh, this one is so important to talk about.
The research dossier frames long-term caregivers as one of the most common populations experiencing identity fusion.
Absolutely. When a person devotes themselves entirely to the care of a sick, elderly, or highly vulnerable loved one, the daily, relentless act of caregiving can slowly consume their entire self-concept.
The boundary between the caregiver and the patient just blurs.
It does.
They stop introducing themselves as individuals with their own hobbies, fears, and dreams. Their entire identity coalesces around being, the person who keeps my spouse alive, or the parent who manages the illness.
Because every waking thought is calibrated to the biological needs and safety of someone else.
And they experience the exact same existential paradox we see in Kurien.
They do. There is immense, profound fulfillment in choosing to care for someone you love. It's a beautiful, active declaration of meaning in the face of a chaotic universe.
Without rigorous boundaries.
It also leads to severe burnout, deep isolation, and the slow, quiet erasure of their independent identity. They forget how to exist outside of their duty to protect.
It really forces you to stop and examine the mechanics of your own relationships.
It does make you think.
Yeah. I mean, have you ever felt that your identity was so tightly bound up in protecting, caring for, or loving someone else that you genuinely forgot where their needs ended and your desires began?
It's a scary place to be.
It is. Have you ever felt that terrifying vulnerability where your entire emotional baseline, your actual nervous system, is completely dependent on the safety and presence of another person?
And that's why these stories resonate so much.
Exactly. These magical, extreme bonds forged in sci-fi and fantasy aren't just escapism. They are a mirror held up to our very real, often overwhelming capacity for loyalty.
The capacity to completely merge our identity with someone else is simultaneously humanity's greatest evolutionary strength and our most profound psychological vulnerability.
It's what allows us to survive the unsurvivable.
But it demands an incredibly high toll on the individual self.
Looking back at the territory we just covered in this deep dive, the mechanics of devotion are staggering. We started by decoding the psychology of devotional conditioning.
Right, exploring how the sudden, intermittent drop in trauma actually forges two identities together like an alloy cooling in a crucible.
And then we examined the neurobiological engine driving it. We discovered that the combination of cortisol and oxytocin doesn't just create trust. It wires our brains into a lethal us-against-the-world defense mechanism.
And finally, we elevated those biological realities to a philosophical level.
Yeah, we explored how, in an oppressive or chaotic world, looking at that neurochemical trap and actively choosing to embrace it can be a radical act of defiance.
It's a way of claiming your own existential meaning, even if it carries the risk of total self-erasure.
Which leaves us with one final unresolved thread from the dossier today.
Let's hear it.
We've established the mechanisms of how devotion can become the absolute core of who you are. We understand how your nervous system and your sense of self can be entirely constructed around the presence of another person.
Right.
But what happens to the self when the object of your absolute devotion is permanently taken away?
That is the ultimate question, isn't it? If you have entirely fused with someone else, if the line between you and them has vanished to the point that your brain processes their safety as your own, Do you simply cease to exist when they are gone?
Or are you forced, in the ultimate and most painful crucible of all, to melt down again and forge something completely new from the shattered pieces? We invite you to ponder that terrifying, beautiful question long after you finish listening today.